been home for a couple of years now, buddy, but you're still fighting the war.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Shoulder to Shoulder, where we tell stories to try to bridge the Civ Mill gap. I am Will Selber, the owner of Grumpy Combat Veteran Media, and I am delighted. We have a great lineup today on all things Afghanistan. I don't think you could get much better. We got Bill Raggio, editor of Long War Journal, senior fellow at FD, who is a regular on this podcast and also Voices of the Resistance. And then I'm also really excited to bring on Lynne O'Donnell, who owns the Substack Project Taliban. And if you haven't subscribed to it, shame on you. Start doing push-ups. Immediately subscribe. Become a paid subscriber. I read it. Anytime she has something new out, I read it immediately. And you should too, if you really want to understand what's going on in Afghanistan. So Lynne, first, welcome to Shoulder to Shoulder. If you could just tell our audience a little bit about yourself, the background, how did you become such a guru on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and stuff like that?
Hi, Will. Thanks for having me. And hi, Bill. It's that's scary. Guru status is pretty scary, I think. I've been a journalist all of my adult life. And, I was based in Beijing for a long time in China. I was in Shanghai as well and Hong Kong, and I covered China and its economic development for more than a decade. And it was the biggest story on the block, as you can probably remember, for a very long time. And then 9/11 happened. And when 9/11 happened, I was on a train between Urumqi and Kashgar, and the trains were very slow in those days. It was a 2.5-day train ride, and I didn't even see the footage of what happened in New York until I went home to Australia for Christmas that year, 2001. It was quite something. But what I did do after I got back to Beijing from Kashgar was I got on a plane and I went to Afghanistan via Tashkent. And I was in Afghanistan in Mazar-i-Sharif at the time of the beginning of the American-led invasion on October the 7th. And that was the first experience that I had of that type of very raw reporting. I'd been in China for a long time and, cycling on anniversaries and big dates and whatever, and the rise of the appalling behavior of the communist authorities, et cetera, and everybody wanting to get in to make a buck. And going and covering the war and the invasion was really quite exciting for me as a journalist. Yeah. And so also China had been on the front page up until that time, and nobody wanted to know anything about China anymore. And if you're a front page reporter, you go where the news was. So I went and basically west from China, and I covered war and terrorism and jihadism and developments like that for the next couple of years. That took me across the Middle East and Spain, Morocco, chasing jihadists and train bombers and stuff like that. And I was in Iraq also when the invasion began there. I went in on a bus convoy put on by one of the Kurdish groups out of Salopi on the Turkish side of the border into Iraqi Kurdistan.
I love it.
Yeah. It was all quite exciting stuff. Yeah.
Wow. Man, Lynne O'Donnell has better war stories than me, and I'm here for it. That's all I got to say. I love it.
Maybe so, yes.
Yes, for sure.
But I did that up until then I went back to Hong Kong and did China reporting again. I did the tsunami and various things that were going on in China and the bombings in the attacks in Mumbai. And then I was with the AFP, the French news agency, and they posted me to Kabul as the bureau chief there. And that's pretty much what cemented my interest in South Asia, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Taliban for the next however long it's been. So that was in 2009. And then I segued from that into AP, Associated Press, and I was the bureau chief there until 2017. And then 2021, once we were allowed back onto, transport, basically the COVID restrictions were lifted. I went back to Afghanistan for Foreign Policy magazine and covered the final months of the war with my long-term partner, not my working partner, the photographer Masood Hosseini. We were together at AFP, then at AP. He won a Pulitzer Prize in 2012, and then we got the band back together in 21, and we did the final months of the war. And because by then we were freelancing, we didn't have to ask anyone's permission. Insurance companies, security guys who'd never been to Afghanistan, our editors, we didn't have to ask anybody if we could do anything. We just went. And so we went all over the country and covered we pretty much set the agenda, to be honest with you, in those final months. And then we were lucky enough to be on the final commercial flight that lifted off on the 15th of August before the Taliban came in, which was very lucky for us because we were, and especially Masood, we were high-value targets declared openly by the Taliban by then. So we felt very lucky to have got out when we did.
Yeah, it's amazing because this show is about 1 year old, and I am getting to interview two people who, when I was in my final deployment to Afghanistan, and I would give, new people would come in, maybe they'd never really read Afghanistan, they didn't understand it, and they would ask me as somebody who I would recommend, what should I do, what should I read? And it was Bill Raggio's Long War Journal. Make sure to read this. Be prepared to be depressed. And then if you also want to read and keep up with what's really going on, it was you. And it was these,
nice.
it was, it was these independent, these journalists who were actually out in the country because, most Americans, Bill, I probably don't realize that the majority of us, the final year, we were in our bases. Unless you were Green Berets. And really a lot of the best intel came from journalists.
Yeah. Because we didn't have the same restrictions. I never lived in a green zone, for instance.
Right.
I didn't really have to. But my biggest, when I was with Associated Press especially, and with AFP to a lesser degree because of the timing, my biggest threat was being kidnapped off the street and held to ransom. And so, my movements were restricted by my own security, considerations as well.
Yeah. This is why, one of the things that I would always harp on young intelligence officers was all the information you're getting from the magic computer that has all the cool caveats and the bells and whistles. Don't forget just to read the newspaper and what you can just get online, because a lot of the time, all the context and all the background that you really need to understand that cool info, you're going to be blind without it.
Yeah, and it made me a very welcome guest at a lot of dinner parties and cocktail parties in Kabul. Honestly, it was the busiest place I have ever worked, ever lived. It was just because everybody knew, all the ambassadors, diplomatic staff, the people on the ISAF RS base knew that we were out there doing the do and moving around and speaking to people. And so, we were sought after. Yeah, for sure.
What have you been doing since the fall of Afghanistan? What have you been focusing on?
Well, for the first couple of years after the fall, after August 2021, I was really very busy. There was an awful lot to report on because there was an awful lot that a lot of people didn't want to have reported on. So especially when I was working for Foreign Policy, sometimes I was in the magazine 3 times a week on the website, with stuff that was going on behind the scenes about the diversion of aid, about corruption in that sort of NGO world, going along with and complying with Taliban edicts on not employing women, for instance. There was a whole lot of stuff at one stage about what was happening to the Afghan pilots, the Afghan security forces who'd been left behind. Taliban atrocities. That kept me busy for a very long time. And then there was, I went to Pakistan and met with people there, people who'd fled Afghanistan. And then I went to cover what was happening in Pakistan itself. This time last year, I went to Miran Shah to see for myself what was happening on the ground just 7 kilometres from the Afghan border, the very serious hot war that's going on there with the TTP that nobody is covering. Yeah. And then in April last year, the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine told me that no one's interested in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so I took that as my resignation letter. and I haven't really been doing as much as I would like to be doing since then. Last summer 2024, I spent in Karachi teaching journalism to graduate students at a journalism college there, which was fantastic. Summer in Karachi. Right. And then I went home to Australia and I flew into Perth and I hired a car and I drove across the Nullarbor to my hometown of Melbourne, which was fantastic. And I've been back, I spent all last year here really working on a book proposal, I will admit. And I did a podcast series for an Afghanistan working in exile media group called Hush to Sub, 8 a.m.
Great organization.
Until they ran out of money. And now I'm considering my future.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for those who don't know Project Taliban, it's your Substack. You had a guest post this I think a couple of days ago, which I just read. It was excellent. How OSINT is the key to holding the Taliban accountable. And I mean, the title alone had me at yes. But if you could talk a little bit about one of your recent articles about Iranian influence in Afghanistan, I think it's kind of important as today is 19 March. President Trump has ordered CENTCOM to conduct strikes that are ongoing, which you can read on the Long War Journal, the ongoing strikes, and then also with what Israel is doing to Hamas right now. It seems timely. So if you could just kind of unpack what the Iranians are doing, what they have been doing.
Well, the Iranians have been hedging their bets in Afghanistan for a long time, and there was quite a presence in the region bordering Iran in Herat and that region. The IRCG was in there with money and funding Taliban groups, even though it was a Shia-Sunni divide. Not a lot of people really wanted to believe that was happening. The Taliban were very aggressive towards the Hazara population, for instance, the Shias there, regarding them as apostate. And so it was very much disbelieved as much as undercovered. But in recent years, and there are people who have been very closely associated with the highest levels of the Taliban who are also close to the Iranians and especially to the Revolutionary Guard Corps for a long time. But in recent months, it seems that the supreme leader of the Taliban, Hibatullah Akhundzada, has been leaning very much more on Iranian money, and they have funded a Praetorian Guard, if you like, a militia to protect him. I'm hearing that it could be 25,000 plus strong. And this sort of comes as the tensions between what are called the Kandahar faction and the Kabul faction of the Taliban have been becoming more pronounced, known about. Yeah. The rivalry between Hibatullah, the supreme leader, and Sirajuddin Haqqani, who is a deputy leader of the Taliban. He's the leader of the very nasty group that his father set up that basically specializes in strategic kidnap for ransom and suicide bombings and all, there were hallmarks of Haqqani attacks that they never took credit for throughout the war. But if you knew that it was a Haqqani attack. And I have long thought that the attack on August 31st at the Kabul International Airport that killed 13 American servicemen and about 170 odd Afghan civilians bore all the hallmarks of Haqqani, and I still believe despite what's been said since then, that was a Haqqani attack. Siraj Haqqani himself calls himself the Caliph. People refer to him as the Caliph, which basically means supreme leader in waiting, and he doesn't make and hasn't made any secret, I don't think, of his ambitions to the supreme leadership. He's a very powerful man, and I think Haibatullah has been at pains in recent months to come up with some sort of a buffer, a way of pushing back on Siraj's very open ambitions. And I think Iran has seen an opportunity there to fund him and arm him and stake a claim to the support of Haibatullah as the supreme leader. As we know, this led to Haibatullah being a little bit more feisty in the way he's treated people who have claimed that they don't like his leadership. It's not just about girls and women's, the treatment of girls and not allowing post-primary education and women to work, but it's a rule by decree, and that's had inspired a lot of people to be quite vocal about the way Haibatullah runs the country. And we saw Stanixai, the deputy foreign minister, basically being sanctioned by Haibatullah, an arrest warrant issued, and he was helped to leave the country by Haibatullah in I guess mid-January, and not by Haibatullah, by Haqqani, and Haqqani went with him and spent more than 50 days, nearly 3 months outside the country. And so what I see is Iran, as always, hedging its bets. I mean, you can't trust the Revolutionary Guards not to also have a foot in the other camp, but I think for the time being, the power looks like it's going to stay with the supreme leader, with Haibatullah as supreme leader for the near future.
I saw a lot of this. There's a lot of chatter, Bill, on Afghan Twitter, Afghan social media, that maybe Haqqani was getting fired as the Minister of Interior, that there was like an outing. But then a few days ago, some of Haqqani's Twitter devotees, I will say, pictured him in Gaza. He just reappeared over the week. Bill, maybe you could kind of give a little bit of background on like Iranian ties to the Taliban, like just some of your greatest hits, if you will.
Yeah, sure. And Lynn, great, always great to see you. Great to speak with you. You're one of my heroes. You did a lot of work in Afghanistan. I mean, I only went there once. Very difficult for someone who was an independent, not linked to a news organization to embed and report. Difficult to travel. So what you and other reporters have done been critical to my work to understanding Afghanistan. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart and what you continue to do today.
Thank you.
So look, I testified in a case in October 2021. It was called Cabrera versus Iran. This was for Americans, including soldiers and civilians who were either killed or wounded by the Taliban. So they were seeking money from Iran for further injuries. It's, part of the federal law, money that's seized from the Iranians. And we won. The case we made was that Iran was providing weapons, financial support, intelligence and training and safe haven in Afghanistan. It was, in my estimation, a very easy case to make. We got a lot of declassified information, but really it could have made the case from open source information as well.
Sure.
People, as Lynn stated, you never believe that Sunnis could work with Shia. That's one of the biggest myths in our entire field. But they do, because the Iranians really didn't have an option in Afghanistan. They wanted America out, and they wanted to deal America a defeat, and they wanted to maintain whatever influence they could inside of Afghanistan. So they side with the Taliban. And so, what Lynn's talking about here, I have no doubt, by the way, I think the Iranians undoubtedly, without a doubt, are backing Habibatullah Akhundzada, the head of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. But I guarantee you they're backing Haqqani and other Taliban factions as well. This is a game they play in Iraq, right? They back the Shia militias in Iraq. They back Muqtada al-Sadr, even though people tell you that he's just a nationalist who hates the Iranians. Why does he still have
Mookie
living in Iran? So I would guess that this is very much, I'd bet good money on it. that
Yeah,
this is.
I mean, because I mean, when I read that article, for me, I was like, some things never change.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
Lynn, that's not to dismiss anything you do. This is like,
yeah,
it's
no, of
further
course, absolutely, absolutely,
Yeah.
and I think you saw it throughout the war, right? They would fund the Taliban while also providing funding to Shia groups in Afghanistan. Making sure that everybody at least has something. It helps keep their influence always going somewhere, hedging all their bets, hero to many. And I'll be honest, like this was when I was there my last year, this was a common thing. It wasn't just Pakistan, right? Pakistan was always the greatest hits. You get a Pashtun, especially near the Durian line, and just hit the play button. It's like Pakistan, Pakistan. But if you went closer to Kabul and especially out west and north, that was Iran was so often heard as well. And I think to the detriment of a lot of people in the United States that they never realized how malign Iranian influence was in Afghanistan and still remains to this day.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
Pakistan
if
was
you-
certainly number one, but Iran
Yeah.
was certainly number two in its support. It wasn't insignificant. It wasn't just a little, like we traced back some, well, all of this from, looking at the inside intelligence. We traced back, cells, the Kabul attack network, as it was known as, led by Haqqani fighters or commanders that, were receiving direct funds from the Iranians. So this isn't surprising. As far, if I may, on the Taliban, the internal politics of the Taliban, I have no doubt that there's disputes between the various faction leaders, and I have no doubt that there's I hesitate to call it a power struggle between Siraj Haqqani and Habibatullah Akhundzada. I have no doubt there's tensions between them, but look, we heard even before the U.S. left Afghanistan and the collapse of the Afghan government that the Taliban were fractured, that there was 11 Talibans or 20 Talibans or all of these things. And yet the Taliban remained united and beat the U.S. and beat the Afghan government and established its Islamic Emirate. And here we are 3.5 years later, the same members essentially. I mean, there's been very few replacements of the so-called interim government that's 3.5 years old now. That's some interim.
Yeah, indeed. But you're absolutely right. I think that, I talked to people about this. Where is he? Is he back? Has he resigned? No, of course he hasn't resigned. Yes, he's resigned. Somebody told me, and the Supreme Leader is considering his resignation like it's, some
like it's an
CEO.
episode of West Wing.
Yeah.
Well,
yes.
I've finally hit my principled stand against you, Akhundzada.
The Taliban leak like a sieve, like our
right.
Yeah.
This ruling against Afghan women, this is a bridge too far, and I must resign in protest.
Yeah.
Well, exactly. But exactly right, because the point you're making is that there is no ideological difference here. And if, people really, I just went to these two conferences, one in Vienna and one in Madrid, and people are desperate to find some sort of chink of light. And, this is the beginning of the end, and it's not. I believe that this is a monolithic. When faced with a threat from the outside, it will become monolithic, and we will see that there is no ideological difference between any of the people who are at the top, because that's where they've been, like you say, Bill, forever. These are the same people.
Yeah, and if I may,
please.
I view it more like, and this is an imperfect analogy, but the disputes between the Taliban within the Taliban is like disputes within political parties in the United States, Republican or Democrat.
Or the Mexican cartels. That's what I tell people. Like, sure, like the Sinaloans and like whatever, they killed each other over here and they hate each other. But you know who they hate more? The feds, the ones that keep them from making any money. They'll band together if it makes them more profitable.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so and Lynn, you nailed it. There is a desire within the Afghan community. We heard, from the very beginning, the Taliban's deputy foreign minister and Siraj Haqqani had a fist fight immediately after the fall of the Afghan government.
Yeah.
And as if
That's it.
Haqqani's goons would let anyone approach within 10 feet with intent of violence to him.
Yeah, exactly.
I've heard story after story like that. I certainly, there's definitely differences. There's power struggles. We should expect that. Your analogy with the cartels, Will, perfect, right? These are power hungry, driven individuals, in this case, who share the same ideological goals. But at each one of them wants to sit on the throne. Lynn, one thing, look, Siraj Haqqani's been called Khalifa since I first heard of him in 2006 or 2007 when the U.S. put a bounty on his head. I think I view that more as an honorific that was given to him than something he put on himself. I'm sure he basks in it, no doubt.
Especially now that he's done the Hajj.
Yeah, right. But he's highly influential. I always remind people, he's the guy that after the Taliban played Weekend at Bernie's with Mullah Omar's corpse for 2 years and issued press releases in his name. Siraj and his father, Jalaluddin, put the Taliban back together. Big parts. Mullah Omar's son broke apart. Several very powerful Taliban factions left the group. And Siraj and his father, Habibullah owes his position of power ultimately to Siraj Haqqani. Now, here we are 10 years after after that whole almost debacle for the Taliban that almost caused their defeat. And I'm certain that the views of each other have changed, but I do believe that Habibullah understands Siraj's power. And that makes sense that he would want to build his own power base, that the Iranians would want to hedge here. And, having a, insider divided Taliban is probably a good thing for the Iranians in the long run. Whoever wins, the Iranians win.
Yeah, the Iranians will always win because if you back everybody, somebody's going to win, right? You say we won. Yeah, but I think you're absolutely right, Bill. You know much more about the intricacies of it than I do, but I think that no matter who it is you're talking to, their power is only going to come from a united Taliban. If you break it up into factions, if there's internal coup attempts or anything like that, then it weakens the structure of the organization. Yeah, and I can't see that.
And this is what
happening.
Makes the Islamic State in Khorasan province such a threat to the Taliban, because it threatens its primacy in Afghanistan. They share the same ideological goals, right? Establish an Islamic State, declare a global caliphate, impose its harsh version of Sharia. And you could put a credit card between the ideological differences between the Taliban and the Islamic State, and yet it's a perfect example of that power struggle. The Islamic State doesn't accept the Taliban's emir as the leader of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, and the Taliban don't want their primacy in Afghanistan to be challenged by a violent group. And that's why, I would guess the Taliban probably hate the Islamic State almost as much as they hate us, if not a little bit more, because they are today, I'm talking about today, right? I'd go back 4 or 5 years ago, you probably would flip that. The Islamic State was probably more of a nuisance and a problem. But today, the Islamic State it makes the Taliban in some ways look weak. And that's one thing the Taliban doesn't like. Today, how do we make the Taliban look weak? With perhaps sanctions, with threats to withhold money. We exert so little influence in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I think, I've been reading and, about the factions, and I think they're absolutely real. And I've talked to enough Taliban commanders that you're like, this commander has more influence in this valley, and this guy has more influence in that valley. And as a former intel person, I think there is a propensity inside the intelligence community to navel gaze and to just kind of look and be like, this faction is this faction is this faction. And there is it feeds into this idea that perhaps we can divide them. And it has been tried in multiple different avenues, officially, unofficially. And the best that the American-led government got was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And even then, it was meh.
Right?
He was still had his toe in the Taliban. That's why he's, he's doing fine. He's still, kicking.
We did that really well, Will, was in Iraq, right? We broke apart that Iraqi overall resistance and broke it down into components. And that's how we were able to build the Awakening, the Sons of Iraq, Concerned Citizens. Weird that we always had 3 names for it, but here we are. And I think that we thought that would be something that would be easy to do in Afghanistan. Iraq, that was it was something that sprang up in the result of the aftermath of the U.S. invasion. But the Taliban were a united entity, yes, with its factions, but the Taliban were a united entity long before the U.S. invaded Afghanistan in October.
Well, one of the things that did come out. Sorry, no, you go ahead, Will.
No, Lynn, please.
Well, I was just going to say that one of the things that came out of discussions at the conferences that I went to was that the Taliban have got such an ethnic grip on power that there could be a rumblings of discontent amongst Tajik and Uzbek Taliban commanders who feel like they're kind of being left out. Their piece of the pie isn't what they thought they were promised before the fall, and that there could be a simmering discontent that could spill into or explode into some sort of resistance up there.
Yeah. Sure.
But that's a maybe as well. But I still don't think that the centralized leadership is unaware enough to allow that to happen. I think they are opportunistic enough and aware enough of what's going on within the various power structures to throw whatever bones it will take to keep people happy and united. I think that is going to be and has been their core priority. That and getting wealthy in their own right, but from drugs and stuff.
Piggyback on that, I'm sorry, Lynn. To piggyback on that, they do have a Tajik commander. His name is Qari Fasihuddin. He's the chief of staff for the military. In Badakhshan, there's a Tajik who is, I think his name is Mullah Ashanullah, I believe, if my memory serves me anyway. He leads a large region in Badakhshan, which is a primarily Tajik. So they do throw these bones. Are they perfect at it? No. And there's Uzbek commanders within the Taliban. There's members of the Taliban who are Uzbeks who have been problematic. But I always view these as, it's kind of is it an indication of a massive weakness between the Taliban and with its ethnic problems? I think those problems exist. I think the Taliban probably do enough to keep those local power brokers happy enough to show. I mean, is Qari Fasihuddin ever going to become the Taliban's, deputy emir or the emir of the Taliban? Absolutely not. The Taliban are never going to yield. It's a primarily Pashtun organization, dominant Pashtun organization. But it will it has shown a propensity. I go back all the way back to, this was always an interesting development to me, tracking the Taliban. CENTCOM in around 2009, 10, 11 started issuing press releases. And they're talking about Uzbek commanders, members of the Islamic movement in Uzbekistan, given controls of districts, shadow district governor, shadow military commander. So the Taliban have certainly made an effort to, in the areas where it needs to cede control.
And I would also say, the Taliban is also, Hamid Karzai is still breathing air. Abdullah is still breathing air. Yeah. And so, when
pragmatism,
exactly.
They're pragmatic. They understand that if they killed the former guy, it would create quite a big stink. At least the world would at least turn maybe for a second and take a look that you just did that. So that way they can continue on with their campaign to kill anybody associated with the American-led war. That's one of the things that when I talk to members of the American intelligence community, the common thing that I get back, Bill, is, well, we haven't seen a centralized campaign. And my response is always, that's not how this is going to work. This is going to be a campaign of, I remember I was traveling to Salmangan, and I'm like, oh, hey, we fought over there. Goodbye, bam. And that's how it works.
Right.
And that's how they're disappeared, and that's how they were never seen from again. But the American intelligence community, as always, they're looking at their adversaries through their own prism, just like people will say, well, Ayatollah Khomeini did not order the 7th October. Well, no, he did not pick up the phone and say, hey, Hamas, go for it. But you set the conditions. So I see all this type of stuff in the American intelligence community when they miss these type of things. I don't know if you guys have run into the same aggravations as journalists dealing with the American intelligence community. I'd love to hear any of your thoughts.
I defer to you, Lynn, first. Go. I do have information, but I would like Lynn has to say.
Well, you're talking about missing the big picture, right? Well, I think it's one of my enduring frustrations now, that I trace back myself to when my editor-in-chief at Foreign Policy said no one's interested in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Well, why? Or even when I was at these meetings, people banging on about the same things, and it's tragic and it's awful and it's terrible, but it's the minutiae. And now I'm going to sound terrible by saying, if you keep telling the world that it's really tough for Afghan women, of course they're going to get bored. But what's happening to Afghan women is part of a whole. And we have to look at the big picture. And the big picture now, I think, is that Afghanistan is the font, it's at the apex of global jihadism and terrorism. And the United Nations Security Council Sanctions Committee is reporting twice a year on this with more and more detail. So it's out there. I'm not making it up. You guys aren't making it up. There is evidence for it, that the links with Hamas and Hezbollah and, the Iranian connections through the Revolutionary Guards, which is an incredibly nefarious and powerful Iranian organization. This is essentially the threat to global security, and it's coming out of Afghanistan as the centrifugal force for it. And that's the way it needs to be framed if anybody is going to take it seriously at the higher security levels. And this is where I feel very frustrated in being told, shut up, And
when I get asked, what do I think about the domestic terrorism threat? Common response is, well, in Afghanistan, where they launched the 9/11 attacks from, the same people are in charge, and you're giving them time and space to figure out something bigger and better.
Intelligence.
And now over the last 6 months or 7 months, however long it's been, they've added an ally in Syria with somebody who is a former Al-Qaeda commander.
Are you ever former?
Right. Do you ever leave the Brotherhood? Yeah. But he has put on a suit, and he is now the head of the interim government.
The haircut too, Will, nicely trimmed.
It's very nice. It's the important piece to the transformation from a radical Islamic terrorist who killed American soldiers to a global statesman cannot be complete without the haircut. A little bit high and tight around the ears, please.
Tight, yeah.
I got to tell you, he played us well.
He played us really well.
Sorry, please.
Lynn, you would mention foreign policy telling you they're not interested in Afghanistan. People weren't interested in Afghanistan in the late 1990s until they were after 9/11. That's a story of my career. I remember after the U.S. surge, I even heard this from a CNN analyst, right? Bill, what are you going to do now that the war in Iraq, the war in Iraq's over? You got nothing to do. And I'm like, you're a terrorism analyst, on television all the time. And you think it's over? And, I'm questioning what you're looking at. It's the story of my career. But you're all from Afghanistan. You got nothing left to do. I mean, I've heard this time and time again. Those people prove themselves wrong, but nobody ever holds them to account. On the issue you had asked about intel, and I think there's a big disconnect between, well, at least the analysts that I speak with, who are understand it. They understood how Afghanistan was collapsing. They understood the Taliban, Al-Qaeda ties, et cetera, et cetera. But everything seemed to get watered down. Not seemed to. It got watered down as it reached a higher level of it went up the chain all the way to the decision making and who's briefing the president. And look, I just refer people, look up that CENTCOM revolt
DIA, Islamic State in 2015.
Yeah.
I know the guy who did the whistleblowing. He was an old boss of mine. But yeah, when basically for the long story short, over a decade ago, I think it was under the Obama administration, there was complaints that the politicization of the Islamic State to make it less of a threat, a JV, if you will, was politicized. And I knew that guy. Good dude. Very smart. Very smart.
I knew some of the people involved in that as well. And that's what happens. And it happens because it's being politicized, because the Biden administration, the Trump administration, the Obama administration, they all wanted to leave Afghanistan. So how do we do that? Well, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda don't have deep ties. They could be divided. The Taliban are a partner in peace. The Taliban could be our counterterrorism partner.
The Haqqani network is no longer a veritable threat. That was according to Barnett Rubin a month after Haqqani first popped up in the UAE.
Yeah. And once it hits, the higher levels, they don't want to see the real analysis. So everyone starts watering down the reports. And that is...
For somebody who's never served in the intelligence community, boy, you got us pegged. I've sat in on these things where, like, you get all and it's not the analyst's fault.
It's not. That's what I want to be very clear about.
I led analysts at CENTCOM. God bless them. I mean, you get these junior analysts, some NCO, and he owns that set. I mean, when you get an NCO who's a real intel professional and he has zeroed in on a target, for me, it was, I'm going to go old school, Jace Rajal Tariq al-Naqshbandi, JRTN, former regime elements, FRE for life in Iraq. And I had a great analyst. And it wasn't the most important thing in the world, but you know what? He owned it. And you get a lot of that throughout the intelligence community. What happens is, to make these estimates, you get different agencies providing different ideas. And the only way they can all agree on it is that all the language starts to get massaged. People start to object to this, to that, to this, to that. And after 16 intelligence agencies get through with it, it's the boring fest that everybody never reads. The National Intelligence System.
It reminds me of that scene in, what was the movie about? I forget the name of it, but it was hilarious. The movie about the killing Stalin. It was kind of right, where they needed to get consensus around the room. They're raising their hand. They're like, it's like that. We have consensus now, and that's all that matters is there's consensus.
Yeah, lines to take.
First, I just want to wrap up and say thank you, Lynn, for coming on the show. We're going to have you back on again and again, because you and Bill and a few others are, my Afghan teachers, and I read all your work, and I've learned so much from you. So first, thank you for coming on the show, taking time, and Bill, thank you as well. But Lynn, if you want to, plug anything you're working on right now, I'll turn the show over to you so you can close us out. But thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you. And it's really my honor to be here and to be talking to both you and Bill. Thank you. I wanted to tell you why it's called Project Taliban. When I went to Miran Shah in Western Pakistan last year to see the war for myself, I drove up. I went as a guest of a Pakistani politician called Mohsin Dawa. And he comes from a village up there called Dawa, and he was standing for re-election. He wanted to win his seat back in the elections that were held on February the 8th last year. And I knew that he'd had a little bit of a trouble in January, on the January the 3rd last year. And he told me that what had happened was that his convoy, he was in a 2-car convoy, both armoured cars, thank God, that came under ambush twice in the course of a couple of hours. And I saw the car that he had been sitting in, and there was a bullet hole. He was in the passenger side, a bullet hole here and a bullet hole there. If he hadn't been in an armoured car, he would have been killed. A couple of people were killed, others very seriously injured. It was a very serious TTP, Pakistani Taliban ambush. And we talked about it for a long time. It had got like a one paragraph in a newspaper in Pakistan, because that stuff doesn't happen, right? And he wanted me to go up there for a few days. I said, no, I'll come up early in the morning and I'll leave before it gets dark. And what I saw there was, the Pakistani military doing, walking and patrolling the streets. They'd be walking up one side of the street, and on the other side of the same road would be a Taliban checkpoint where they'd be stopping cars and shaking down the drivers at the same time. And, never the twain shall meet, or, whatever. And then there was the election a couple of days later. And when the votes were being counted, it was a really corrupt, as we know, process. And Mohsin Dawa and his supporters were locked out of the counting room, so they were protesting outside of it, and the Pakistani military opened fire on them, and he was shot and injured very badly in his leg. I saw him in Madrid at one of these Afghanistan conferences. But he has seen the Taliban come and go, and now they're coming back, and people are leaving, as they do when their lives are in danger. And he calls this Project Taliban, and that's where I got the name from for my Substack newsletter, because this is what we're seeing. It is a project, yes, and it is a very stealthily yes, being stealthily rolled out, and it's happening before our eyes and under our noses and with our awareness. And there, I think, is a willful unawareness of it, yes, ignorance of the reality of what is happening in that part of the world that is affecting all of us. I live in London. There's a guy that I know, he's a journalist here, was attacked in his asylum hotel and stabbed so badly by Taliban supporters that he's had to have multiple operations on damaged nerves in his arm. This is around us. It's everywhere around us, and we need to be very, very aware of it. So that's my long-winded explanation for Project Taliban.
So, hey, everybody, first, thanks, Lynn, for coming on. Bill, thank you as well. Everybody, immediately, if you haven't done it already, Project Taliban, subscribe to it, become a paid subscriber, support the type of journalism that our Afghan allies need so that their tormentors can be held accountable. This is how it's done. The big newspaper agencies, they're just not going to be focused as much on what's going on anymore. And it's through independent journalists like Lynne O'Donnell, Bill Raggio, and a bunch of other ones that we are trying to do our best to keep track of the Taliban. Yeah. So do me a favor, support Lynne O'Donnell, support Bill Raggio. Hey, support us too. So we're trying our best. Go ahead and give us 5 stars. Share it with your friends. Share it with your enemies. Just go ahead and share it if you could. This is GCV6, and until next time, I'm out.